Rick was born in Texas.
All right, turn in your Bibles to the beginning of the Gospel of Mark. That's what we are starting on today. Mark is the second book of the New Testament, as you will recall. So we're going to learn about the author today. We're going to learn about sort of how and why he wrote his gospel as well, and it's very, very interesting. As my wife Michelle would tell you, that the Gospel of Mark is, well, she'd say, that's your favorite gospel, right? Well, one of them. She says that because I'm always talking about how Mark he writes like a movie director. And I love movies, by the way, if you can't tell in my sermons and stuff, but he's a movie director who lived 1,800 years before there were any movie, before the movie camera was invented. So anyway, so maybe think of it as he's a movie screenwriter or something. That's maybe a better accurate. Okay, so this is a screenplay we've got in front of us, and only back in Bible times, the screen is your mind. So that's as we read the Gospel of Mark, we're picturing these things in our brain like we're watching on a screen, and that's kind of the way Mark writes. That's what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to picture it. Now, a few things to remind you. As we are introducing the Gospel of Matthew, we learned about that there's a big debate about who wrote first. And a lot of people believe that Mark wrote his Gospel first. Why? Because Matthew wrote this first edition. We know that that's true because of the testimony of early witnesses, like the disciple of the Apostle John, who says Matthew wrote first in Aramaic, and he wrote a collection of the sayings of Jesus. But then it's kind of educated guesses from there. Mark comes along and he writes this movie screenplay about all that, and it's full of action. Okay, and so this is an action movie. Of course, there's some dialogue, of course, in an action movie, but it's called an action movie because it's all about the story, and it's about these things that happen and how the plot drives things and all that stuff. Okay, so Mark is all about action. And you get a few teachings of Jesus along the way, but these are kind of the differences. And a lot of Mark's stuff is reduplicated in both Matthew and in Luke. And so we think that maybe Matthew and Luke borrowed some stuff from Mark, or there's this theory that they all were borrowing from some common source. The Latin word quella in Latin means source, and people didn't know what to call this. This is theoretical, by the way, theoretical. Maybe they're all borrowing from this source, which could just be the oral tradition of the stories that people heard the apostles telling over and over again. And when you hear these stories, you begin to memorize them, right? And so, you say, I know how that story goes. Well, if the apostles were telling these stories for 30 or 40 years, and then somebody comes and writes them down, you'd say, I've heard those stories. I know that comes from a common source. Whatever the source may be it could just be the teachings of the apostles. And they would use common language, they would use common words and all that stuff in their teachings. So this is just to remind you about some of the theories of how the gospel writers write. Luke comes along and he says, I have done the thorough research. I have researched everything. I've interviewed people. I have researched things. And so he's admitting, that he's going to borrow from all these different sources, whatever he can find, and put it all together for us. And Luke says, this is my method. This is the whole point of what I'm doing for you when I write my gospel, is I've done the research and now I'm presenting it to you. So that's Luke's method. But Mark's, remember, is just this screenplay, this action. And so anyway, that's why Mark is kind of exciting. And Mark is, you know how I've explained about how our Bible readings work in church, right? Our 3-year lectionary. Have I explained, you know what I mean by that? Like our gospel readings for this whole year, ever since last, beginning of Advent, after Thanksgiving last year, have been mostly from Matthew. You recall that? We've been just kind of reading through the Gospel of Matthew for our gospel readings. Well, after Thanksgiving, we begin a new church year, the season of Advent, and most of our gospel readings will be from the Gospel of Mark for the whole next coming year. So pay attention for that, and you'll probably hear me say again and again, oh, Mark writes like a movie director, and look how he's presenting this scene to us. Okay. But in the very beginning of the Gospel of Mark, the very first verse, I want somebody to read that for us, just the first verse of Mark's Gospel here. So whoever's got it can go ahead.
The beginning of the Gospel about Jesus Christ, the Son of God.
Okay, so there are kind of 4 key elements in that. He starts out, what is this thing that you're about to read here? It is the beginning, is the first thing that he says. It's the beginning. Well, what does that, what's that supposed to make us think? If he says, this is the beginning.
Beginning of Genesis.
Okay, well, it reminds us of Genesis, right? That the very first word of the Bible is in the beginning. In Hebrew, that's just one word, in the beginning. Let's see. Yeah, I don't think I was trying to remember Matthew. Let's see. This had his starts out with the genealogy, yeah. Yeah, he doesn't have the word beginning in his. It's Mark that has the beginning. And that's another reason why a lot of people want to say, hey, Mark should be first, because he starts out this is the beginning, right? But what else does this make us think of besides the first verse of the Bible? Or what does beginning mean, if this is a beginning?
The start.
Okay, it's the start of things, and what the start of what?
The gospel, which is the birth of Jesus Christ.
Yeah, and it's and not just the birth, but I mean the whole story of Jesus. And yeah, so it's the beginning of the gospel. And gospel means good news, but it also means a story. This is one of our few church words that we use that actually comes from English, Old English, and it means it has the word spell in it, because spell means story. You know, let me weave you a spell, right? Well, that's kind of Old English. We don't talk that way nowadays, right? But it means story, and this is a contraction. Either kind of depends on who you ask, but I don't know if it stands for good. I think it's good. The good story or news. But it could also, in my mind, stand for God's story. God's story, right? So what is the gospel? It's God's story. But it's also good story or good news. It means that our God came to save, rescue, and save us, and about how He wants to have a relationship with us. And pretty much everything we preach and teach in church is, we could put under the blanket term of the gospel. It's the good news of what the Bible teaches, right? It's the gospel. It just means the message of the Christian faith, right? So, but this is just the beginning, which means it's the start, and it's a continuing thing, right? The gospel of Jesus Christ goes on, and the story goes on. We don't speak of any ending to this. The beginning, Mark talks about the beginning, but this is just the start of something new and never ending too, right? Okay, so at the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, and even if you were a person who didn't know anything about who Jesus Christ is, and you're opening this up for the first time, and you never heard of Jesus before, you'd say, oh, well, who is this Jesus Christ? Well, I'm going to learn about him in this book here. So that's good. That's what we're going to learn about. But you're going to learn specifically, and here's Mark's fourth point in his opening verse there, that who is Jesus specifically?
Son of God.
Yeah, he's the Son of God. So you're going to learn that this is a story about who Jesus is. He is the Son of God. Now, Mark gives you a spoiler alert. You're not going to finally understand this until the very end of the book. But he's giving you a spoiler in the beginning. This is the whole goal. Our whole goal here is to understand Jesus as the Son of God. Does that make sense to everybody? And so the amazing thing is, as we're watching this movie of Mark, watching the movie on the screens of our mind again, right? As we're watching this movie, it's interesting because all people don't understand who Jesus is throughout the Gospel of Mark. And so this is kind of a running theme, is people don't understand who Mark is, but the people that do finally kind of come to realize who Jesus is, that he truly is the Son of God, and the ones who believe are all the people you wouldn't expect to believe. It's the foreigners. They're not even Israelites. They're not even of the people of God, so to speak, and yet the foreigners are coming to faith in Jesus. And finally, and here's a big spoiler alert. If you don't want to hear the end of the story, then say la 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 la. But in the end, Jesus is dying on the cross, and the Roman centurion, the soldier who's crucifying Jesus, when he sees how Jesus died, that he didn't, I mean, this is a guy who maybe has crucified 1,000 people before, or hundreds or whatever, it doesn't matter, but this guy knows how to do his job, and he's seen lots of people die. When he sees how Jesus dies, he says, what did the centurion say?
Truly the Son of God.
Yeah, truly this was the Son of God. That's Mark. Only in Mark do we hear the soldier at the foot of Jesus' cross confess, I've never seen anybody die like this, in this manner, and so I'm convinced that this man was the Son of God. Fascinating, isn't it, that a professional soldier, and you wouldn't expect him, I mean, that's his job, that's his business, killing people. And yet, when he sees how, the way that Jesus died, Mark says, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, "Ah!" or whatever, or maybe it's a cry of pain or whatever, and then he dies. Boom. I mean, nobody cries out with a loud voice and then boom, they're gone. I mean, who dies like that? Right? Who dies like that? And yet, that's what we see in the Gospel of Mark. And you say, wow, that is interesting. It's because the Roman soldier realizes this man is dying on purpose. He wants to die. He's up there, I mean, just on purpose, And this is all part of a plan. And this Roman soldier comes to realize that from seeing Jesus die. And when you see Jesus die, you're going to realize that too, that this man truly is the Son of God. So, Now, another key feature of the Gospel of Mark, though, is just like a movie where Mark isn't going to tell you what you're supposed to believe about all these things. He's just going to show you the scenes. The scenes come up and the scenes come and go, and a lot of times the action is moving quickly, and Mark doesn't editorialize. Like, for instance, I'll give you an example. John does just the opposite. John will say, now Jesus said this because he wanted people to understand blah, blah, blah. Or Matthew says, this was all to fulfill what was written through the prophet. And Matthew kind of gives a little interpretation that, oh, Jesus is fulfilling all these scriptures. But Mark doesn't do that. He just tells you what Jesus did or what Jesus said, and kind of leaves it up to you. Well, not just up to you. He knows the Holy Spirit is going to be speaking to you and working in your hearts. So the Holy Spirit will convince you of what the truth is. And so, Mark, turn to chapter 16, the end of the book. Chapter 16. And I may have shown you this before, but well, we're doing it officially here in Bible class to remind you of these things too. Mark chapter 16, verse 8. Now, yeah, page 1538. 1538. Now we'll be reading Mark chapter 16, verse 8, but to give you a little context, you'll recall Jesus has died on the cross. They buried him in the tomb right at the end of the Sabbath. These women go to the tomb to anoint Jesus' body. So it was their custom to put spices on the body, not only to counteract the stink and all that stuff, but sort of as an embalming process and all that. So they go very early in the morning, just after sunrise, and they notice that the stone is rolled away, and they see this young man. Mark doesn't tell us who the young man is, so it's just a mystery. Who's this young man? And let's see, dressed in a white robe, right? That's kind of, when we think of the other parts of the Bible, we say dressed in a white robe. That's kind of telling, isn't it? But that's all he says. A young man in a white robe, right? You decide who that is. And he says that Jesus isn't here, he's risen. Go tell the disciples, and specifically Peter, who denied him, interestingly, and as the leader of the disciples. He is going ahead of you into Galilee, and there you'll see him. And so now verse 8. And before we read verse 8, I want you to notice that there is a line, a break after verse 8. You see that? And what does the little note right under that line tell us?
The earliest manuscripts and some other ancient witnesses do not have Mark 16, 9 through 20.
So what that means is this is a later addition to the Gospel of Mark. This is a conclusion that somebody else tacked on to the Gospel of Mark. Does that mean that we should totally ignore it? Well, no, but it just means this wasn't part of the original Gospel of Mark, and somebody wanted to put a nice, neat, happy ending on the end of it. But it doesn't, the way Mark wrote it, the way this movie director directed the movie ends at 16 verse 8. Yes.
So if we're comparing this to more of like a movie screenplay, does that mean with, added the 9 through 20, that makes this the director's cut?
Yeah, director's cut, yeah. Or this is a little bonus scene after the credits or whatever.
Extended edition.
Extended edition, yeah. So this you only get on the extended edition DVD, but what you see in the theater ends after 16 verse 8. So somebody read for us Mark 16 verse 8, the true ending of Mark's screenplay.
Trembling and bewildered, the woman went out and fled from the tomb, They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid.
Yeah.
And this, and we say, Mark, this is the gospel. This is the big conclusion that you're leading us to, is chapter 16, verse 8. This is how you're going to conclude the gospel, the good news, the good story about Jesus. Is this? They went out. The women went out trembling and bewildered, and said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. The end. And people would, and people for 2,000 years have said, well, what kind of ending is that? You know, you can't just end it right there. What happens? What happens? Right? Because I think that's what Mark wants you to say is, wait, that can't be the end. And Mark's whole point is, that's not the end. Remember? This is only the beginning of the story. And when you get to the end of this is here Gospel of Mark, it's still just the beginning of the story. Right? So you're supposed to say, wait, that can't be the end, because it's not the end. Right? So that just kind of gives you a, what is this Gospel of Mark? And we say, wow, when we look at all this stuff, we say, that's pretty amazing how he wrote this book. Isn't that interesting?
So where did 9 through 20 come from then?
Those were later Christians added that. I don't know exactly.
Oh, so it wasn't actually Mark, it was just...
No, yeah, Mark didn't add it. It was other Christians who added it later. And perhaps, I don't know, maybe it was apostles. I don't know. It was much later. Because when it says the earliest manuscripts and some other ancient witnesses do not have these, we mean this ending didn't appear on Mark until maybe 100 years later, 150 years later. I don't know the specific dates on when this ending started to appear, but the whole point is there were lots of Christians who were saying, that's not a satisfying ending on the end of Mark. What if this is the only thing that an unbeliever hears, and what if people think, oh, I lost the last page of this book, I'm reading this book, and the last page got lost or ripped out or something like that, this can't be the end of the story, and we need to put a nice little happy ending on the end of it, and like I said, that doesn't mean this added ending to Mark, this extended edition or director's cut or non-director's cut or whatever, is worthless. It means that the early Christians thought, well, this was approved by the early church, and they kept it ever since, whenever it was added, they kept it with the Gospel of Mark and passed it on to us. If they didn't feel like this was a worthy ending, and if they didn't feel like it was, worthy of the apostolic teachings and worthy of the church keeping it, they would have gotten rid of it. It wouldn't have survived. People would not pass on something that they don't think is worthy, but they did think it was worthy, and so that's why it's still in our Bibles today.
How did Mark die?
Let's see, I'm not sure about the traditions about Mark. We'll see lots of other things about the gospel writer, but I'd have to look that up. Because there are kind of traditional stories about each of the apostles, like who went where after Pentecost and all that, and which direction they went. Mark spent a lot of time with Paul, the Apostle Paul, in his travels, and also with Luke, who was with them. And his name is actually John. His whole name is John Mark. He's called in the book of Acts, John Mark. Mark's cousin, Barnabas, he was even bigger companion or more steady companion of Paul on his journeys. So you remember stories about Paul and Barnabas. So that's Mark's cousin. And actually Barnabas is the one who convinced Paul to bring John Mark. John Mark was a young man even at that time, and so Paul kind of needed some convincing to bring Mark along with them on their journeys. And at one point it says Mark abandoned them, well, not abandoned them, but he wanted to go home. Maybe he was homesick or whatever, I don't know, but he didn't finish out the missionary journey. He went home, and Paul was a little bit annoyed by that, that John Mark just had to go home. For, like I said, I think he was probably homesick or whatever. Not everybody was used to traveling back then, not like we do now, because it's so easy for us to travel. So. But as far as how he died, I'd have to look that up. So, yeah. Okay, so we will get to more about the author and a lot of interesting things about John Mark. But first I wanted to watch this overview video from the Bible Project, guys, on the Gospel of Mark. And you'll notice who's in the picture here, the summary picture for the Gospel of Mark. Who's that guy?
The Roman soldier?
Yeah, the Roman centurion, right? That's like the climax of, of course, Jesus rising from the dead, that's pretty climactic too. But this is really a high point in Mark's gospel that Mark is leading you to. The centurion says, this really is the Son of God. And hopefully you, the reader, or you, the one experiencing this screenplay, will come to the same conclusion along with the centurion.
The Gospel of Mark is a book in the Bible about the life of Jesus. And the earliest reliable tradition tells us that it was written by a guy named John Mark.
Now, Mark didn't just grab a bunch of random stories about Jesus and throw them together. He's designed this book to address some really specific questions about whether or not Jesus was the Jewish Messiah.
So let's stop right there, because that's a term a lot of people like me aren't very familiar with.
Yeah, so the Messiah was a royal figure, sometimes called the Son of God, that Israel was expecting to come and set up a kingdom here on earth. And around the time of Jesus, Israel was occupied by Rome, and so many Jews were hoping that the Messiah would come and overthrow the Romans and rule as king.
But Jesus didn't overthrow the Romans. In fact, he was killed by them.
And that brings us to the very issues Mark is trying to get at in this book. So in the first half, he focuses on who Jesus is. Is he really the Messiah? And then in the second half, he's addressing how Jesus became the Messianic king. And then right here in the middle of the book is this pivotal story that brings the two halves together, and Jesus answers both of these questions.
Okay, so let's talk about the first half of the book, who Jesus is.
So Mark makes his beliefs about Jesus very clear from the first line of the book. The beginning of the good news about Jesus, the Messiah, the Son of God.
One of the next stories is Jesus getting baptized, and God's voice announces from heaven, "This is my Son." So it couldn't be more clear. It's presenting Jesus as the Messiah.
Yes, but as you're reading through this first half of Mark, you'll notice something really interesting start to happen. Jesus is going about healing all these different people, and he's constantly telling them to keep quiet about who he is. This happens so many times in Mark's account, it's very strange.
Yeah, why keep it a secret?
So remember, lots of Jews had lots of different expectations about what the Messiah would be and do. And so Jesus doesn't want people to misunderstand what it means for him to be Israel's Messiah. And so with all that in mind, we come now to the pivotal story at the center of the book, where Jesus takes his disciples away and he asks them, "Who do you all say that I am?"
And Peter says what everyone's been saying, "You're the Messiah, the Son of God."
But then something new happens, because Jesus starts explaining to them how he's going to become the Messianic king, and it is not what they expected. He says he's going to suffer and die and rule by becoming a servant, or in his words, the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to become a servant and to give his life as a ransom for many.
Peter is startled by this, and he rebukes Jesus because there's no way he's going to let Jesus die. And Jesus responds, "Get behind me, Satan," which is really intense.
It really is. But it highlights how important it is for Jesus that his disciples come to understand who he really is. And so here, now in this pivotal section, Jesus tries 3 different times to have this conversation with them, and every time they respond in confusion and even fear.
Okay, so this launches us into the second half of the book, where Mark addresses the question of how Jesus becomes the Messianic king. It's the last week of Jesus' life. He goes to Jerusalem, gets in conflict with the religious leaders, and gets arrested.
And he's put on trial as someone who's claiming to be the king of the Jews. He's even given a crown and a purple robe like a king would get, but it is all a cruel joke.
Then he's mocked and beaten and hung up on a cross where he dies.
And it's here in this crucial scene that we meet a new character
A Roman soldier.
who suddenly gets everything that's going on.
He says, "Surely this is the Son of God."
Which is crazy. It's an enemy who's first putting it all together that Israel's messianic king is the crucified Jesus.
That's the structure of the book of Mark. But the book doesn't end with Jesus dead on the cross.
No. So on the third day, some women go to visit Jesus' tomb, only to find that it's empty. And then there's this angel standing there, instructing them to go and tell this good news that Jesus is alive from the dead. But instead, they run away and they don't tell anyone because they're afraid, and that's how the book ends.
Which is a really abrupt ending.
Yeah, it's so abrupt that later scribes did add an ending that brings more closure to the story. And you'll find that story in your Bible with a little footnote that says it was added much later. But Mark's a brilliant storyteller, and he's intentionally ended this book abruptly. So all through the book, the disciples have been confused about Jesus' plan to give up his life, the story in the middle, and now right here at the end. It's like Mark is acknowledging just how startling this claim really is. And he wants you, the reader, to wrestle with it for yourself. Is this crucified Jesus really the Messiah that they've been waiting for? We think the Bible is one grand unified story, and so we're making videos about each individual book of the Bible, showing you how it's designed and how it fits into the overall story.
We also make theme videos where we take a biblical theme and we trace that idea from the beginning of Scripture all the way to the end.
We're a nonprofit, and we want to give away all these videos for free, and you are helping us do that. You can go to our website, jointhebibleproject.com. You can give a one-time gift. You can sign up to become a monthly supporter.
You could download full resolution versions of these videos, download study guides, posters. It's all for free. Jointhebibleproject.com.
Include their little commercials at the end because, I like these guys and I like what they're doing, making these videos to help us understand about the Bible. And of course, it's all stuff, most of what they said was kind of stuff that I said to introduce the book, but it's interesting to see it with all the artwork and stuff, and I think they do a good job. So, anything new that jumped out at you from the video, thoughts that you thought were cool, or questions that you had?
I thought it was good just how it broke it out. You know, the one thing we hadn't talked about yet is how in the middle it brought it together.
Yeah, exactly. So
It's interesting how the video just stopped. You know, they didn't give us a line and we continue to read. They just stopped. And you kind of put yourself in that position. What if this was never added? You're wondering what happened, right? What
yeah,
happened after that, right?
yeah, exactly. But Mark isn't the only gospel about Jesus, and so thankfully we have, Mark is flanked by Matthew and Luke as well, and John too, who comes along and writes for different purposes. So, okay, the Gospel of Mark, they didn't quite come to the great thing that I thought they were going to say. So this is why it's a good thing I'm here to kind of expound some of this stuff too. But see, Mark has two central foci. Okay, so the Gospel of Mark is like I better use a marker that's not getting so tired. So you remember from high school geometry class what an ellipse is, right? An ellipse is two circles that are smashed together to make one shape. Here, you pretend that these are perfect circles. My drawing isn't so great, but anyway, see two circles there smashed together. This circle has a center point, right there. this circle, oops, I erased the other circle. I erased the wrong one, but anyway, this circle has a center point right there. And those are the two foci of the ellipse, the focuses. Okay, so the Gospel of Mark is like this. Now, they said the first part, the first half of the Gospel of Mark comes to this conclusion in at the end of chapter 9, where Jesus says, "Who do people say that I am, the Son of Man, is?" Let's see. Let's get it right. How Jesus asks. Or actually, it's chapter 8. Actually, chapter 8, verse 27. Who do people say that I am? Yeah. In the other gospel writers, it's who do people say that the Son of Man is? And Mark is just who people say that I am. And Peter comes up with the right answer. Of course, in Mark, it's just the shorter, you are the Christ, which means Messiah, okay, which means anointed one. So, that Jesus is the Christ. And they, throughout in that video that we were watching, they used the word Messiah, and it means the same thing, remember? So Jesus is the Messiah, and that's one thing that you're going to learn from the Gospel of Mark. So this conclusion to the first part of the book, who is Jesus? But they showed that the second half of the book starts with chapter 11. Well, what about chapters 9 and 10? What's going on with those? Well, chapter 9 is very important. It's all actually this whole section, chapter 8, starting with verse 27, the whole Caesarea Philippi incident, all the way through chapter 11. This is that time where Jesus is explaining, this is what I've come to do. So how is Jesus the Messiah? Yeah, so how is Jesus the Messiah? Or what kind of Messiah has he come to be? Or questions like that. That's the second half of the book here. Second half. But there's this whole incident in the middle of it kind of brings everything together. And so what happens at the beginning of chapter 9 then? So who do people, well, let's finish up chapter 8 here. So who do people say I am? Peter says, you are the Christ. And Jesus says, he warns them not to tell anybody, but in chapter 8, verse 31, what is Jesus explaining to the disciples? Chapter 8, verse 31. Somebody just read that verse for us. 8:31.
He then began to teach them that the Son of Man may suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, chief priests, and teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and after 3 days rise again.
Okay. So, first of all, I want you to tune in. Mark uses the words very specifically. They're very specifically chosen words. So he says, he then began to teach them. Remember that for Mark, this beginning is a key, sort of a key word or concept that he uses here. This is now a new beginning that I'm beginning a new section of the book and a new section of Jesus' ministry. He's beginning to teach them, what now? From this time on, from this time forth?
Basically how he's the fulfillment.
Yeah.
What's going to happen.
Yeah, and how he is the Messiah, how he's going to do his Messiah work, his saving work, by suffering, right? Suffering, and we saw that in the video. And of course, how could the disciples understand this? Of course, Peter is going to take him aside, and there's a great scene in my favorite Jesus movie, Jesus of Nazareth, the one I'm always talking about, where Peter comes up And, I don't know, maybe I should show you, well, we don't have a lot of time now, but I'll just tell you about the scene. Peter has been, this is right up, like that night, they go to bed and they're sleeping, they're all kind of sleeping around on their sleeping bags or whatever with Jesus, and Peter, you can tell he's really thinking about all this kind of stuff, and because it also, we think about from Matthew where Peter says, we must never let this happen to you, Lord, and Jesus has to rebuke him and say, get behind me, Satan, and all this stuff, right? So that's what's happening in verse 33, chapter 8, verse 33. But Peter is like, he comes up to Jesus. He says, it's our duty as your disciples not to let you fall into the hands of the Jews and to let them mistreat you and put you to death. So if it's your intention to go to Jerusalem, it must be our duty to try to stop you from that, Jesus. Right? And that almost makes sense when you think about it. I mean, isn't that what Peter's supposed to say? And Jesus says, no, it's not your duty to try to stop me. This is my mission. This is why I've come. You know? But it's a really great scene how they do it in Jesus of Nazareth. So maybe we'll watch that next time or something. Like I said, I like movies because the way that the directors use the different elements and sometimes even silence. There's a lot of silence in the scene because you see the actors, the characters. Peter is thinking about things and he's wrestling with things, he's struggling and he is nervous and Jesus is, kind of saying, no, Peter, this is a voice of temptation for me, but I have to resist that too. And all these things are going on, in this movie scene. And a picture is worth 1,000 words, right? So.
Pastor, you talk about this, and you can reflect on society. Our society is all about, on one hand, getting all kinds of medicines and painkillers and ways so you'll never feel the pain, right? And then on the other hand, the legal people say, you wrong Sam, you wrong Sue, so here's pain and suffering, you're going to pay this much for the pain and suffering, right?
Yeah.
So there's those two things in society, and here Jesus just invites it all.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And how is that? How could he want that? How can he say, this is what I'm embracing, this is why I've come, is pain and suffering and rejection. So, but we get to a bigger climax, and this is what it builds to. Who is Jesus? The big question, who is Jesus, builds to now chapter 9. And what happens beginning with chapter 9, verse 2. Okay, so chapter 9, verse 2. What's that story about? We don't have to read the whole section here, because you know what it is.
Transfiguration.
Yeah, the Transfiguration. So they go up on this mountain, and this, by the way, is a strange incident, very strange incident, but this is the first real focus of Mark's Gospel, the Transfiguration. And the Bible Project guys didn't say that. I was hoping that they would. The Transfiguration is the first big climax that the first half builds to. This is the climax that's also going to drive us into the next, the second half of the book. So, what happens in this Transfiguration? Let's see. Let's read verses 2 to 4. Let's read chapter 9, verses 2 to 4. Somebody take those for us.
After 6 days, Jesus took Peter, James, and John with him and led them up to a high mountain where they were all alone. There he was transfigured before them. His clothes became dazzling white, whiter than anyone in the world could bleach them. Read 4.
Yep, and 4 also.
And there appeared to be before them Elijah and Moses, who were talking with Jesus.
Okay, so Mark only, well, actually, we could include verse 7 as well. Then a cloud appeared and enveloped them, and a voice came from the cloud. This is my son, whom I love. Listen to him. So three significant things happened. Three unusual things happened. First, Jesus' appearance changed. And what did he look like?
White,
What
whiter than bleach
Yeah,
even.
his clothes became dazzling white, okay, maybe even shining or something like that. So that's a not a normal thing, okay. Nowadays, if I was to make this movie scene or something like that, I could have a person wearing a white robe, and we could put LEDs under their underneath their clothes, right? Because we have the technology now, LEDs. You have a little battery pack or something, and you got strands of Christmas lights, basically all wrapped around the chest. And I could even wrap my legs in Christmas lights too, right? Battery powered ones. But hey, you know, and then it could be dazzling white and shining. But I don't think it would still be the same effect that Mark is talking about here, even if I had LEDs under my clothes. But I like to joke about these things. But okay, so that's the first thing. First unusual thing. The second unusual thing is verse 4. Who appeared with him?
Moses and Elijah.
Yeah, and notice Mark says it backwards, Elijah and Moses, because Moses lived before Elijah did, long before. And so why does Mark say Elijah and Moses? That's an interesting thing too, because in let's see. In verse 11, so the disciples pick up on this as they're coming down the mountain. What's of all these strange things that happen? This is most interesting. Of all the things that they just saw, and by the way, the third thing is they hear this cloud appearing. Got to put on your coronavirus mask and steam up your glasses again. Get the full effect, right? So this cloud appears, and a voice from the cloud. Who else's voice could that be? You know, Mark doesn't have to tell you whose voice it is, because you know, right? This is my son whom I love, listen to him. So of all these spectacular, amazing things that happen, what's the first question that the disciples want to ask Jesus in verse 11? So somebody read that for us. Chapter 9, verse 11.
And they asked him, why do the teachers of the law say that Elijah must come first? 11 through what?
Just 11,
Okay.
yeah. Is my Bible printed funny? Because mine has just Jesus replied and then a bunch of blank space.
Oh, we got that too.
What?
What?
Where's the response?
There is no response.
Is this printed wrong? Because Jesus does give a reply there. I know what his reply is. But where is it in our Bible?
That's just Mark being the director again.
Jesus replied, and this is so secret we can't even write it down for you.
Isn't that funny?
What
They just forgot to type the red letters on that, just this page specifically.
Oh yeah, because it was supposed to be red letters, and the whole page. Look at verse 19. The red letters of Jesus are missing, and then in verse 23, whole bunch of blankness said Jesus.
The next page is fine. It's just this page.
These Bibles are misprinted because the red ink didn't print on this page.
I think the director did a lot of cutting here.
Ours has it in.
Oh, your copy does have red letters on that
It's all
page?
in here.
Oh, okay.
Oh, read Does it have verse 12?
We're not supposed to know why Elijah comes first.
No, this Bible doesn't have,
Seriously?
doesn't have the red letters.
Squeeze it.
Does yours has the, oh yeah, see, ours is missing all the red ink on this, just this one page. So there is blank right here, and blank right there, and blank. That's just weird. I never saw that. I mean, I've never seen that before in these Bibles, but anyway, Jesus replied, yes, to be sure, Elijah does come first, and basically he goes on to say a bunch of stuff that's confusing about John the Baptist and so on. John the Baptist came and people did to him whatever they wanted. They killed him, in other words, and basically he's saying that's what they're going to do to the Son of Man too there. Yes, you want to read Jesus' reply for us? Okay.
Yeah, 12 and 13. Jesus replied, to be sure, Elijah does come first and restores all things. Why then is it written that the Son of Man must suffer much and be rejected? But I tell you, Elijah has come, and they have done to him everything they wished, just as it is written about him.
Okay, so
That's it.
Elijah comes first to restore all things, and in the prophet Malachi concludes, as we saw in our Matthew study, that behold, before the great day of the Lord comes, I will send my messenger to prepare the way. And so Elijah comes always before the coming of the Lord, and because that's what the scriptures say. Elijah will come first before the Lord comes and takes his place as the king of all. And so it's interesting, as Jesus is dying on the cross, they think he's calling out to Elijah. What's the deal with Elijah? Why does Elijah keep coming up? Because Elijah comes before the Lord, comes in his glory, So anyway, so what's the big deal with Elijah? That's what the disciples want to know in verse 11. Why does Elijah come first? And that's why Mark the gospel writer doesn't say Moses and Elijah, like we're all tempted to say. He says Elijah and Moses, to kind of underscore that very point. But the whole point of and it's just about time for us to quit, I know, but the whole point of the Transfiguration is that it is the first big climax in the Gospel of Mark, is because it shows who is Jesus. Who does the Transfiguration show Jesus to be? You tell me, what do we learn from this?
What was that again?
What does the Transfiguration, how does the Transfiguration answer the question, who is Jesus?
Well, it shows that he's
The physical transformation.
Yeah, the physical transformation is one proof of all that. And what does the voice from heaven say?
This is my son.
This is my son? Okay, so God is testifying this is the Son of God. Okay.
But he also does that when he's baptized also.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. Yep, so more than once God is testifying that this is true. But are people getting the message? No, they're still asking, who is this Jesus guy? Nobody knows, right? Peter says, you are the Messiah, the Christ. And Jesus says, good answer, that's right. But you also have to know that I'm the Son of God, and they kind of both go together, right? But the Transfiguration shows who Jesus is, and also that Moses and Elijah are appearing there to say, this is the one we've waited for. This is the one that we've prophesied about. This is the Savior that God promised to send, that our ministries were all about. Okay, so basically he's got the backing of the whole scriptures. Moses and Elijah represent all the Old Testament peoples. Okay. So that testifies that he's the Christ, the Messiah. God himself says he's the Son of God. And you've got the best witnesses you can get, if you're calling witnesses to the stand, to say, hey, if I'm trying to show you that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, what better witnesses to call than these guys, right?
And they appeared and then they disappeared.
Yeah.
So that's another sign of God.
It's just and that's all you get, and you don't get a lot of interpretation. You're supposed to figure this stuff out for yourself, right? And they're coming down the mountain, and Jesus says, verse 9, don't tell anyone what you've seen until when? Until chapter 9, verse 9.
Until he's risen from the dead.
Yeah, until the Son of Man is risen from the dead. Then you'll be able to put all the puzzle pieces together. But before then, you don't have the whole picture quite yet. Because the whole picture is that Jesus is going to die and, in fact, rise again from the dead. And that's our second focus of the Gospel of Mark. The second climax that everything builds to is the death and the resurrection of Jesus. So this middle section here is really is really all about the theme of that Jesus has come to be the Messiah, and he is the Son of God, because his glory is going to be through suffering, which we've said and which we saw in the video too. Glory through suffering. That's the teaching of Jesus. That's his way, and it's the way for all of us too. Is you got to go through the suffering, which means God isn't going to take you out of the suffering, and God isn't going to let you go around the suffering, and God isn't going to, whatever. You got to go through it, and you got to experience it too. And that's the way of Christ. So don't ask God to take the suffering away. Jesus never teaches us that, but he teaches us, give us the strength that we need, the patience, the peace, all those things.
At the end of chapter 10, discussing what rising from the dead meant, considering how these people felt at that time, they're going to get this king who's going to free them from the Romans and everything. That must have been quite a conversation.
Yeah, exactly.
It'd be like one they'd like to have recorded.
Let's see. Yeah. Yeah. So what does rising from the dead mean? What does he mean by that? You know.
Pastor, I looked up, Scott asked about how Mark died. I looked it up.
Oh, John Mark. Yeah.
Yeah, want me to read it?
Yeah, sure.
When Mark returned to Alexandria, the pagans of the city resented his efforts to turn the Alexandrians away from the worship of their traditional gods. In AD 68, they placed a rope around his neck and dragged him through the streets until he was dead.
Oh, okay, yeah. So that's the traditional.
Alexandria, Egypt.
Yeah, that's the northern coast of Egypt, and Alexandria became a sort of a semi-headquarters of Christianity, at least for when you get toward Africa. Then Alexandria was the Christian headquarters down there in the south, and Antioch, where Paul and Barnabas launched their missionary journeys and stuff. That kind of became a headquarter of Christianity up in Antioch, besides Jerusalem itself too. But so Alexandria, there were a lot of Christians down there, and Mark went down there and became, pastor, so to speak. But he was, of course, sharing his apostolic witness and all that, and so killed in 68. That could have been just, less than a decade after he wrote his Gospel of Mark. Because it was all in around either the late 50s, early 60s that the gospel writers were writing their gospels. Mainly, again, and we said last time, in response to some of the apostles are starting to get killed off.
Well, that's what I was kind of wondering,
Yeah.
why he ended where he did.
Yeah,
Maybe it's because that's when it ended for him.
well, I don't think it was that I don't think it was because he didn't have time to finish his gospel. I think he had already written it maybe, 8 or 10 years before he died, something like that. So it's not that he didn't have time to finish. I think he meant to conclude with chapter 16, verse 8.
What's that called, writer's cramp or something?
Writer's block, writer's block.
They didn't get to come back.
The ultimate block of a writer is to kill him, right? Okay, so we'll learn more about Mark next time, but kind of keep some of these themes in mind. And then we're also going to talk more about the gospel writer John Mark next time too. We're going to look at some of the other passages that give us some information about Mark and who he is, because he doesn't tell us about himself in the actual Gospel of Mark, just like a movie director doesn't give his own biography within the movie. You gotta watch the special features for that. So next time we get some special features, the making of the Gospel of Mark. So okay, let's close with a prayer. Once again, Heavenly Father, we thank you for teaching us the gospel of Jesus Christ through your gospel writer, John Mark. And we thank you for the unique ways that they write to help show us the truth of who Jesus is and what he's come to do for us. Now bless us now as we go forth into our daily lives and daily tasks and responsibilities, that we can be your witnesses to Jesus in all things. In his name we pray. Amen. Okay, thanks for coming today.
Thanks, man.